everyone. Welcome. Everyone is filing in. Thank you so much for joining us today. As you're gathering around, please feel free to let us know in the chat where you're joining us from. And if you want to add what the weather is like where you're at, I will let you know that here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, it is frigid. It is so cold. And Tristan was sharing with us that he's in Detroit and you had a whiteout, I think you said. And
Yeah,
so
couldn't see
it's
out my
so cold
window.
here. Yeah. So please keep us in your thoughts as we go through this very difficult time in winter in Michigan. All right, so everyone is joining us. One of the things that I love about these webinars is that it doesn't matter if school was canceled, if you want to be cozy in a coffee shop or in your living room, you can join us from wherever you're at, and the best seat in the house is the one that you are in. So, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, to all of our alumni and friends of the University of Michigan, those of you who are joining us via Zoom or LinkedIn. My name is Kiera Trotter, and I serve as the Director of Alumni Career and Education of your Alumni Association, and I use pronouns she and her. We are very excited to have a wonderful partner here with us today, Tristan Layfield. And Tristan is going to help us explore this month's webinar topic, which is ACE your next interview, from preparation to practice. Before we jump in, I have a couple of housewarming items to cover with everyone. So first, we have some really cool stuff coming up with the Alumni Association, and Brooke is going to put some of these in the chat, and then we'll share links to all of these things in the follow-up email that you'll receive tomorrow. But a couple of highlights. We have a LinkedIn article series that we just launched this week. It is the Recent Grad's Guide to Career Success. So if you are a recent grad, if you're a part of Gen Z, or if you're a supporter of anyone who's a recent grad, please feel free to check that out and share. We have an awesome career design fellowship coming up for those of you who want to create a more fulfilling career. Our U of M DEI Impact Certificate for anyone who wants to gain the skills necessary to engage in a diverse environment and make an immediate impact on your community or workplace. That's getting started next month. And then, of course, we have some amazing webinars coming up, and there's a wide range there. And so please feel free to register for those. And then finally, we're planning for our webinar series for the next fiscal year, which starts in July. And so if you have any ideas of topics that you're just itching for us to cover, please let us know. We pay attention to that feedback and we do our best to implement it as much as we can. All right, so as usual, this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be shared with you via email tomorrow. Please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A feature in your toolbar. The chat feature is also active, and so you're welcome to participate in the discussion with other participants throughout the session. Many of you submitted questions upon registration, and those were amazing. Thank you so much. We'll do our best to get to all of your questions today, whether you submit them live or via registration. But it's likely that we may not be able to get to all of them, but fear not, we will do our best. And Tristan has graciously offered options for you to connect with him one-on-one, and we'll share those options at the end of the webinar. All right, so let's focus on Tristan. Tristan Layfield is a University of Michigan alumnus, class of 2010, and the owner and principal career coach at Career Clarity Solutions, which has helped over 1,500 people identify and leverage their unique value proposition to transition their careers. His practice, rooted in personal leadership and self-advocacy, helps empower job seekers to effectively communicate their value to attract their ideal jobs and employers. With his work featured on major platforms such as the Harvard Business Review, LinkedIn Business Insider, Black Enterprise, and Entrepreneur, commas are very important. Tristan aims to help job seekers build professional brands that transform their mindsets, advance their careers, and expedite their job search. Tristan is an amazing partner to our Alumni Association, and so it's my pleasure to turn things over to him. It's all
Thank
yours,
you so
Tristan.
much for that great introduction, Kiara. I really appreciate it. And I always love working with you all. So thank you for having me. And hello, everybody. I see in the chat, we got people from all over the place. I see Jolynn checking in from Detroit. I'm in Detroit too. I had to call that one out. But I see we have people from the UK, DC, LA, San Diego, Ferndale, okay, Dallas. Thank you all for joining us today. And so, as Kiara said, we're going to talk a little bit about how to ace your next interview. We're going to talk about from preparation to practice. I'm going to go through this information initially pretty quickly just to make sure we get through this and we can get to your questions because I know that some of you guys have some burning questions that you want to get out, and I believe they will help everybody. So, this is. First, before I get into the content, as she said, my name is Tristan Layfield, the owner and head career coach at Career Clarity Solutions, formerly Layfield Resume Consulting. And I've had my work featured across many numerous platforms. But the biggest thing that I want people to really take away from this is understanding that my role here is just to help people understand the hiring process as best as possible. I come from a corporate background, I've hired for Fortune 500 companies, and now I'm really bringing that information to job seekers to make sure they understand what those companies, what those hiring managers and recruiters are looking for. And so, what we're going to cover today includes we're going to talk a little bit about things with in person interviews. We're going to talk a little bit about virtual interviews. We're
Sorry,
going
I'm
to,
so sorry to interrupt, Tristan. I just want to
yeah,
make sure that everyone is able to see Tristan. It looked like one person had a concern, but I just want to make sure that that's not widespread. Can you see Tristan? Great. All I need is one thumbs up. Thank you so much. Sorry about the interruption,
perfect.
Tristan.
Oh, no, it's completely fine. I appreciate it. So we're going to talk about virtual interviews. We're also going to talk about interview strategy and some tools for practice, and then we're going to get to the Q&A here. Okay. So let's start with that interview preparation. I cannot stress enough how much preparing for interviews is important, and I don't think people do it enough, right? So let's talk about what preparing for an interview really looks like, right? The first thing is we want to research the company. And what I mean by that is, yes, you want to go to their website, right? You want to look and see if they sell products. What products do they sell? Have you ever used those products before? If they sell services, understand the type of services that they sell. Go to their about section, understand a little bit about the company, their mission, their values. The other thing that I tell people when we're researching companies, not just what they want to tell you, it's also what's out there in the zeitgeist, right? So Google their name, go to the news tab and see, have there been any recent articles that have been written about them, any new projects they're working on, anything that you can find on the internet, including their social media profiles. Go through those things so you can have a good understanding of those companies and organizations that you're speaking to. The other thing is, you want to research them because you don't want to ask questions that can easily be answered on the internet, right? If it can be easily answered on the internet and you ask that inside of an interview, many recruiters and hiring managers will say, well, I'm not exactly sure you're serious about this job, right? You could have found that answer. So we want to make sure we take the time to research those companies and organizations. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second. I do want to say we are going to have Q&A at the end, but I love interaction in the chat. If there are any questions, if anything resonates with you, anything, put them in there as we're going because I am monitoring them and I'll make sure that we try to address them as we go. Now, the second thing, we need to reflect on our experience. One of the biggest mistakes that people make when they come to me is that they believe that their experience is something that they already know, right? They lived it, it's something that they've gone through. But the unfortunate piece is that after about a year and a half back, things start to get really fuzzy up here. You don't always remember things very well. And so we need to take the time to really reflect on our experience and understand what skills have we gained? What have we achieved? Right? What have we changed? What have we optimized? Really think through those things because those things are going to be the basis of the examples that showcase your work inside of the interview. It's going to be the basis of the thing that you sell yourself with to those potential employers. So later we're going to talk a little bit about a strategy to answer interview questions, behavioral based interview questions. That strategy is actually a really good way to reflect on your experience as well. So when we get to that, I'll remind you that this strategy should also be used for your reflection process. Now, another big overlooked piece of that preparing for in person interviews practice, right? We need to practice our interviewing. Most people come to me and say, hey, I get really anxious or really nervous before interviews or during interviews. Well, I can't say that we can completely eliminate that, right? Nerves are a good thing, actually. It actually means that you care about this opportunity, you care about this thing. But there are some things that can help you calm those nerves a bit, and practicing is one of those. So, grab a friend, grab a family member, your partner, a colleague, a classmate, whomever, and go through some common interview questions. Work through how you want to present those examples, right? These things make sure that you're prepared. And when we are anxious or nervous inside of an interview, what we're really relying on is our brain's muscle memory, right? To get those answers out. So the more we reflect on that experience and the more we practice those answers, the more our brain naturally knows what to do and take over when we get into that anxious state. Now, number four, you want to know who you're interviewing with. And I think this is a very, very largely overlooked area of preparing for an interview. Now, you want to know who you're interviewing with because you want to know what their position is in the company, right? If they're an HR person or if they're your direct manager that you would be working under, because you're not going to necessarily ask very technical questions to the HR person, and you're not going to ask a lot of HR questions to the technical person, right? So we want to know who we're interviewing with so we can get our questions together and know who we're interacting with. The other reason we want to know who we're interviewing with is because we want to find points of connection, right? Most of the research shows that if we can connect with people, they can better see themselves working with us, right? People want to work with people that they connect with. So if we can find points of connection with them, we can make ourselves stand out from the crowd and make them remember us. Right. So I often tell people take some time to find that person on LinkedIn, right? Go through their profile. Maybe you all have worked at some similar companies, or maybe you went to the same school or similar school or gotten the same certification, or maybe they mentioned something about an interest they have and you have the same interest, right? These are things that you can use to build rapport. And building rapport is going to be incredibly important in being remembered throughout your hiring process. Now, the last question or the last thing for preparing for in-person interviews I'm going to mention is you need to prepare questions for the interviewer. Now I want to ask, and I want you to respond inside the chat. How many of you have ever gotten to the end of an interview and they ask you, do you have any questions? And you say, no, you answered most of them. Has anybody ever said that? Just give me a yes, give me a thumbs up, give me something in the chat, or a no. You have, Joshua. Yes. Okay. I see. Guilty. Yeah. Right. No. Okay. Good job, Michael. So many people do get to that point and they say, I don't really have too many questions. Well, honestly, you're not doing yourself a favor here. And here's why, right? Number one, recruiters and hiring managers often use this as a way to see how interested and engaged you are in this process. If you're really interested in working for this company or getting this role. The second thing is, no matter how much a company wants you to believe that an interview is a one-way street, it is not, right? It is a two-way street. You are interviewing the company just as much as they are interviewing you. And so you are giving up your right to find out the information that will help you determine is this company or is this role a good fit for you? Are you going to get the things that you want out of it? So later, we're going to give some resources out. And one of those resources is actually an article that has numerous questions that you can ask inside of an interview, right? Things about, what's expected in the first 90 days, how your performance will be measured, questions about the team, about the interviewer, about the company, all different types of things, right? But there are some questions that we should also potentially avoid in beginning interviews. Like, if we're in the first interview, asking about money is typically frowned upon by many companies and organizations. Now, I personally don't agree with that, but I understand that that's what companies and organizations feel. And so I just like to put that out there for people. But nonetheless, I recommend that if you have an hour long interview, you prepare about 3 to 5 questions for the interviewer. And I say 3 to 5 because a couple of questions will be answered. So you have a few more to lean back on, right? If you are going for a series of interviews, maybe a half day of interviews with a couple of people, prepare about 5 to 7 questions because you want them to be varied, and some people are going to answer some, and some people are not, right? So we want to make sure that we have enough questions to ask everyone. Now, I see the question in the chat: is it okay to ask in the end for the compensation range? Now, typically, if I am, consulting with a client and they want to know about the compensation range, I typically find that the best time to ask about that is after a second interview, if you're going to ask. In all honesty, most of the times I tend to wait for companies and organizations to bring up the money. I know that's not what we want to hear as job seekers. I understand, but it is such a touchy subject for many companies and organizations that I tend to try and avoid it until they bring that up, just because I know that sometimes they use that against some job candidates. Okay. Now, let's talk about preparing for virtual interviews. Now, I like to separate these things because preparing for in-person interviews, everything that I talked about before is incredibly important, and it's still incredibly important for virtual interviews. But when it comes to virtual interviews, there are a few additional things that you need to be aware of and make sure are taken care of. So, the first thing is check your internet and technology. We all have those dead spots in our home, right? Those spots we know we don't have really good cell service or really good internet service, right? So, obviously, if we're doing a virtual interview, we probably should not be taking it there, right? But the other thing that I mean by check your internet and technology, turn your camera on, make sure it works, make sure your microphone works, right? Make sure you can access the platform that they are providing to you to interview on. Now, some of them are going to be really easy, like Zoom, right? All of you guys got into Zoom today. I figure you know how to do that. Now, there are actual platforms that are designed for interviewing processes, like BlueJean. And some of those platforms require you to actually create a profile. And so if you are 5 minutes before the interview trying to create a profile, you have to wait on the email and verify your profile and then get logged in and get settled, right? It becomes a really big task. You become very anxious, and it's really hard to recover from that after you sort of gotten yourself worked up. So I always recommend earlier in the day or the day before. Make sure you're able to access the platform. And if you have any issues, you can then contact the company and you look like a proactive candidate. Right? Now, number two, set the scene and minimize distractions. We are usually taking these virtual interviews at home. Now, I do want to do a little caveat here. Please do not take a virtual interview from any major public place. And what I mean by that is Starbucks, the lobby of a McDonald's because they have free internet, whatever the case may be. If you're having internet issues, then I suggest going to your local library. Many of them have quiet rooms or individual rooms that you can utilize to actually do your interview. But if you are at home, right, these are our places of comfort. This is where we live. This is where this is where we are comfortable, essentially. So I always tell people turn your camera on ahead of time and see what your camera can see in the background, right? We don't want anything laying out that is going to embarrass us or anything laying out that may disqualify us or what's on our walls, right? Some of you might not be able, you're not able to see my background now, but behind me is actually a TV, right? If I was on an interview and my TV's on back here, it gets very distracting, right? So make sure you know what's in your background. And the other thing with minimized distractions, many of us live with other people, right? Large humans, small humans, animals, whatever the case may be. So communicate that you're going to be taking an interview in this room, right? Ask the other large human to make sure the children don't run in, or make sure that your dogs or your cats are put away, right? We know cats are notorious for walking in front of the camera, right? Now, sometimes if you're like me, I have two dogs. One of them is very calm. The other one is mixed with what I like to call tornado. Well, the calm one I typically leave out because he's a nice conversation piece. People will be like, "Oh, is that your dog?" And I get to introduce him. But you need to know your pet very intimately. I tend to just recommend most people put their pets away. Right? Now, the next thing is get dressed, right? And I'm not just talking about from the waist up. I know this is a virtual interview. We're at home, we're comfortable, right? But get dressed up. The tornado, they're both actually Boston Terriers, actually. I'll show you one at the end of the presentation. But both of them are Boston Terriers. They're like yin and yang, though. But get dressed. Not just from the waist up. We saw it during the pandemic. All right. If we don't have pants on, we're probably going to see it. It's amazing how much you shift inside of your seat. So I always tell my clients to get dressed from the ankles up, at least put on some jogging pants. But my recommendation as a career coach is to get dressed like you're actually going to the interview. Right. Psychological studies show that what we wear impacts how we present ourselves. Right. So if we are getting dressed like we're going to the interview, it actually does us a favor because we are already at home and it's very easy to slip into our comfortable postures of leaning and all those things. But when we get dressed like we're going to an interview, we show up differently. Right. Now, the last thing is sit down prepared early. Give yourself about 10 minutes to get situated. You're going to sit down and be like, oh crap, I forgot water. I forgot a pencil. I forgot my resume. Right. So make sure you're sitting down for 10 minutes early. Give yourself a little second to woosah and get logged in. Okay. Now, if you have any questions on any of this, anything else, don't hesitate to put them in the chat. Now, what are your thoughts on headsets? So personally, I don't have any recommendations on a particular headset, but I do recommend that everyone actually wear some type of headphone that has a microphone in them or attached to them. Now, as far as presentation and appearance, right, I would not necessarily wear, if you have any of those gamer headphones that light up and do any of that stuff, obviously I would not recommend those. But if you have some over the ear headphones like I have on now, these are my favorite headphones. That's why I use them, but it doesn't look unprofessional, right? Brian says they use a hidden headset. If you have AirPods, sort of the Beats Pros that go over your ears, right? Any of those things, I think all of those are completely fine as long as it's just not something that's distracting from you itself, right? Now, when we're talking about going to an interview, right, I want to give you a couple of tips here. You want to arrive around 10 minutes early. You don't want to arrive inside of the interview too early, just because it does make you seem a little bit desperate. But the other thing is, you're going to sit there and you're going to psych yourself out that whole time. So I recommend, even if you decide to get there early, maybe 30 minutes early because you're worried about traffic or finding the place, that's completely fine, right? Sit in your car, do your woosahs, right? Play a game, call that person who calms you down, maybe go to the coffee shop across the street. And then walk into that building around 10 minutes early, right? We also don't want to throw off our interviewer's day. They could be doing something incredibly important in front of our interview, and then they get a call 30 minutes before the interview, like, hey, your interviewee is sitting here. They feel rushed. They might come into your interview with a bad attitude, right? So just walk in about 10 minutes early. The other thing is you don't want to arrive late, right? You seem uninterested or you seem like you cannot be somebody who is trusted to arrive to your job on time. So make sure that you do arrive early. If your interviewer is not on camera, should you stay on camera also? The what I would do is I would actually ask the interviewer what they would prefer at that point. Honestly, I think that's a bad interview practice. If an interviewer is going to ask you to be on camera, they should also be on camera. But if they are not on camera, then what I would say is you probably should be. I actually got this tip from another career coach. What they do when they do virtual interviews, they actually don't like to look at the interviewer or themselves because they get distracted by themselves on the camera. So they actually print out a picture of someone and tape it right under their camera and they speak directly to that picture of the person. It helps them provide more eye contact to the camera and it puts them at ease. So that's a tip if your interviewer decides to not be on camera. But overall, I would just ask the interviewer themselves if they prefer you to be on camera or if it's okay if you go off camera. And next, be nice to everyone you encounter, right? It is imperative that you understand you do not know who you're interviewing with, right? You never know who is watching, right? So you could be interviewing with somebody who lives next door to you and you have no clue, right? So be nice to everyone you encounter. You don't want to, give off any bad vibes to anyone. Definitely be nice to people like the receptionist, to any janitorial people you meet while you're on your way there, right? Those people know everybody in that building and their business. So you just want to be kind and be nice to everyone you encounter throughout that time, right? You go to the coffee shop across the street, you're not so kind to the barista, and somebody who works at the company is right behind you, right? You just want to be mindful of that. Next, we want to provide eye contact. Now, Eye contact is something that gives off an air of confidence, but it also shows people that you are engaged. Right. Now, I'm not telling you to be weird about your eye contact, right? We don't want to just be in their face staring like this, right? That's gonna weird them out. It's not gonna get you the job. But you do want to make sure that they are your home base. You return back to this person as you are talking, or while they are talking, you're providing that eye contact to show you are engaged. What happens when an interviewer has not read your resume and asks you a simple question like what type of degree you have? Brian, unfortunately, you just have to answer the question, right? And try to answer the question without that tinge of, you didn't read this, did you? Right? Try to answer it as best as possible without that tinge. But what I will tell you, Brian, is that make note of that for yourself, right? When you are going through an interviewing process, I tell all of my clients that the hiring process is the best indicator of what it would be like to work for that company or organization, right? If they come unprepared to your interview, it's likely that a lot of times they're coming unprepared to meetings, right? They're not necessarily doing the pre work. Things are going to get a little dicey sometimes with a lot of people that you work with. Companies should be putting their best foot forward because they are courting potential employees. And if they don't believe that, then that is something that tells you a little bit about the company or organization, right? The next thing is remember names, right? Names are one of the first way that we show signs of respect to people. So just make sure that you try to remember it. If you are bad with names, like I am, right? As soon as you can, write them down. So that way you can come back to them. No one really likes to be called the wrong name, right? The other thing I'll tell you this is if somebody has a name that is difficult for you to pronounce, I can guarantee you'll win more brownie points by simply asking them, hey, can you pronounce your name for me? I just want to make sure that I get it correct, right? Someone who's had their names butchered for their whole life would absolutely appreciate someone asking them how to pronounce it and working to get that correct. That also can be something that helps you stand out. Now, the last thing is reduce fidgeting. This can be a distraction for some and come off as uninterested in to others. Now, I'm a natural fidgeter. It's something that calms me down. It's something that helps me think and process. So, as an interviewer, I don't mind when other people fidget as long as it's not insanely loud or crazy distracting. But many interviewers see that as something that says that you are not engaged. So, as soon as you notice that, just try to stop it. Sometimes if your hands are like mine, they just start fidgeting with things. Sometimes I got to do that sit on your hands thing, right? So that way they don't just start moving and doing whatever they'd like to do. Benjamin says, approximately how long should your answers be? That's a great question. There's no one right answer to this. We don't want to go insanely long, right? We tend to find that about 90 seconds to 2 minutes is a sweet spot if we can stick to right around that. That's usually what we tend to recommend, but there are some questions that just require a little bit more in depth answer. And then there's some questions that aren't as in depth. So generally, it's going to be about 90 seconds to no more than 2 minutes. Should you bring multiple copies of your resume in case the interviewer doesn't have it, or is it an old school thing that's not relevant anymore? So that's a really great question. I actually still bring copies of my resume, and I actually bring copies of my resume on really nice weighted paper. That's my own personal thing. So if someone asks for it from me, it sort of leaves an impression. But just bringing copies in general is great. Also, you should bring a copy for yourself as well to be able to reference if necessary. Now, the last thing in preparation we're going to talk about is virtual interview tips. So everything from before still applies, right? For from the in-person interviews. But now with the virtual interview tips, we have a couple more. And these are incredibly important in an in-person interview as well, but they're so important with virtual interviews. And here's why. Your body language. It's incredibly difficult to read people through a camera, right? People don't really pick up on a lot of cues or can't pick up on a lot of cues. So we want to watch our body language. We don't want to slip into those comfortable postures that leaning back, that leaning on your arm, right? We want to make sure that we are sitting up straight, we're engaged. Oftentimes, I tell people to look sort of right below your camera. It gives the best effect of natural eye contact. But you just want to make sure that people can sort of pick up on you being engaged in the conversation. Number two, make a connection. So I said this before with the in-person interviews, but it's incredibly important with a virtual interview. I'll give you an example. So back in November, there was one week where I had 40 consultations with potential new clients, right? 40 conversations. That's with new clients, not to mention my old clients that I talked to that week. Someone booked something with me from those 40, and we met about 3 weeks later, and she's saying, "Yeah, remember back in our consultation, we talked about this." Unfortunately, I just simply didn't remember her because I talked to so many people during that week, right? And she didn't make a connection with me. So what I'm trying to showcase inside of that example is that when we are speaking to people virtually, it's incredibly easy for them to forget you if they've never met you before. So make a connection with them in some way and find a way to try and stand out. And then the last thing is follow up within 24 hours, right? Most people do not follow up after interviews. So this alone, this small, gentle gesture of a thank you email can make sure that you stand out a bit more than other people. What I tend to recommend is to do a thank you email same day of the interview, but at least do it within one business day of the interview. Now, the other thing with this is with follow-up emails, as if you haven't heard anything back, you know, you can follow up after a week or two, but try to stay on top of it without annoying the people that you are actually engaging with as well. I saw a couple of questions come through. I've been on searches. Oh, well, where can I get tips on improving my resume? Well, Lauren, for me, I actually had a webinar with U of Alumni Association last year on resume. So I'd suggest go back and watching that, but also later you're going to get a link for a free 30-minute consultation with me, and we can talk a little bit about your resume. Susan, I've been on searches, albeit for academic positions, where we did not consider follow-up emails because of equity issues. Always common practice in other countries. Have you seen any change in the follow-up email in corporate? I haven't seen any changes in the sense of official policies of consideration around them. Usually, it's not something that I think people immediately know they're considering, right? And when I say a follow-up email, I'm not saying anything that's sitting here to try and sell you really on me as a candidate even further, right? It's a thank you so much for your time, reiterating your interest in one sentence and letting them know you're available for any questions or issues that they may have, or maybe even asking about next steps. That's what I mean when I say a follow up email. If somebody's trying to sell you in the email after the interview, that typically means they felt they didn't do very well. So oftentimes I would say the emails I'm talking about aren't necessarily something that would be sort of consciously considered. It's just something that puts you back top of mind on the recruiter's list, right? If you're waiting on someone else to interview you and the first person asks personal questions, how would you respond, especially if it's a question that might impact your work schedule, like having young children? That's a really great question, Daniel. If they do ask about things about children or any of that stuff, I tend to just simply thank them for the question. I really appreciate you asking. Unfortunately, during interviews, I tend to not talk about my personal life, but I do really appreciate you inquiring, right? And just move on. Don't make it awkward. Don't make it shamey. But I often recommend that tactic a lot for women because with women having children, there tends to be a little bit of a double standard that I've seen inside the interview process. But that can be something that anybody with children can utilize. Now, let's go into talking a little bit about interview strategy. Susan, I do see, should you email everyone you've met during the interview? I would simply put them on a group email if it's multiple people. But if you want to email them individually, you're more than welcome to. Now, going into interview strategy, before we can talk about strategy, we need to have a good understanding of the type of questions that you're going to be asked inside of an interview, right? So, number one are questions about you. These tend to be pretty straightforward questions about your background or even things about character, things of that sort. So, these are questions like, tell me about yourself. Or what's your biggest strength? What's your biggest weakness, right? So these are questions that are simply about you. So we need to have an intimate understanding of ourselves to be able to answer those questions. And we're going to go through and talk a little bit about a couple of those in just a second. Next are questions about the company. All right. This is where that research about the company comes in handy because there will be companies that might ask you, well, why do you want to work for us? Or they'll ask you, have you ever used our products? Or tell me what you know about the services we offer. Right. So you need to be prepared to answer those type of questions. And that's where that company research that we talked about at the beginning really comes in handy. Now, the last type of questions that you tend to get asked inside of a standard interview are behavioral based interview questions. These are the most common interview questions that most people get. And behavioral based interviewing is a technique that employers use to assess candidates based on their previous behavior, right? So these things are typically very easy for us to spot. They start with things like, tell me about a time when, have you ever, describe a time when, give an example of, right? So I know many of you have heard those questions inside of interviews previously. And so we need to be prepared to answer those. And we're going to talk about how to answer them in just a second. What's a good way to make that connection? Should it be related to the job? Any examples would be appreciated. Yeah, so as I said earlier, there can be things that are related to the job or not related to the job, right? So maybe you look at their LinkedIn and you guys worked at the same company previously or competitor companies, because sometimes that's nice. Maybe you guys went to the same school or got a certification from the same place, or maybe you're in the same type of organizations. These can be things to connect with people over, right? The other thing is there's personal things. Like I said, I leave my small dog out in the back because he's cute. He doesn't bother anything. He doesn't bark when I'm on interviews. He doesn't interrupt me, anything. But they see him and they ask questions about him. So I bring him up, and people are like, oh, and now they say, oh, that's the guy with the dog, right? The cute dog. And hey, if they're going to remember me because of the cute dog, I use it. Right. But I'm not telling you to be sort of weird and creepy about this, right? So let's just say you're interviewing with Emily on Friday and you find Emily's Instagram and you see Emily has two dogs. You don't go into the interview and say, hey, Emily, how's your two dogs? Right? It gets really awkward, uncomfortable. She might think you're a little stalkery, right? There might need to be a restraining order or something because you're in her personal business like that. But you find a way to work it in, right? Emily asks you, oh, how have you been doing? Or how are things going? Oh man, I had to unthaw a little bit because I had to go home and take my dogs out, and the weather's been insanely cold. And now Emily's like, "Oh, you have dogs?" Yeah, I have dogs. I have two Boston Terriers. And next thing you know, we're bonding over dogs, right? I didn't bring up that she has dogs, but I knew she probably was a dog person. You can use those things. Right? Should I ask my references in a letter of recommendation, even if hiring manager didn't request it? Typically, no. I tend to provide things that the hiring manager requests. So let's get into these strategies so we can wrap this up and get to the rest of your questions. So the first strategy we're going to talk about is what's called the STAR methodology. So some of you guys might have heard of this, some of you all might not have heard of this, but this is a structured approach used in job interviews to answer those behavioral-based interview questions, right? Now, the key thing here, before you get into the STAR methodology, is that you need to have a relevant example for the question that they're asking, right? Using this methodology for an irrelevant example is not going to help you, right? But when we're talking about the STAR methodology, when it comes to answering interview questions, this is also the methodology I was talking about earlier, when we're talking about reflecting on your experience, right? If we use the same methodology to reflect on our experience, once it comes time to answer those questions, we know what we need to get out. So let's talk about what the STAR methodology stands for. So the first is situation, right? Think of it exactly like the word says. You are situating the interviewer in what was going on, right? You're providing all the necessary details that are relevant to the example that you're providing here. Now, it's really easy to, run on and give all type of unnecessary details, especially when your, stress or anxiety gets to you. But your job here is to keep it concise and only provide the information that is undeniably relevant to situate them in the example. Right? Second, the task, right? You are telling this story for some reason, mainly because you are a main part of this, right? So you want to tell them what your task was here, right? What were you tasked with? What did you have to do? Did you have to review the data so you could solve the problem? Make sure you let them know what your task was. From there, you want to tell them what action you took to solve the problem or generate the results, right? So here, it's incredibly important that you give them step by step. You don't want to actually gloss over the actions you took, meaning you don't want to give really vague statements like, I worked really hard on it, or I did some research, right? Don't tell them what working really hard entailed. What steps did you take? Or what research did you actually do? And how did that actually help you get that outcome that you're about to explain, right? So make sure that you provide them with actual steps that you took right? If they say, "Give me a time where, or tell me about a time when you solved a problem, and when you had a problem, and what did you do to solve it?" Right? So you want to tell them the step by step of what you did in that example. These are not questions where it's time to provide general answers, right? If I had a problem, typically here's how I would approach it. That's too general. When we're looking for behavioral based interview answers, we're looking for actual tangible examples of your work. Now, the last thing is the result, right? Here you want to dish out the results. Remember, employers don't just care what you did, they care about why it mattered. And that's the results, right? That's the outcome. Now, of course, the results should be positive. If they're not positive, this probably isn't an example that you should be providing, unfortunately. But if you're anything like me, sometimes my mouth moves a little faster than my brain. And so I'll start talking and be halfway through the STAR methodology and realize, oh crap, this answer doesn't have a great ending. And so we'll talk about what you do if that's the case in just a second. But if it does have a positive ending, you provide the results. And if you can quantify them, meaning if you can put numbers to those results, you should absolutely do that, right? Numbers stand out to us all the time compared to just a very wordy answer. So make sure that you provide those results and quantify them wherever possible. Now, if you're somebody who are like me and my mouth moves a little faster than my brain, and you realize the results are negative ones, there's something we can do, which is called the START methodology, right? And essentially, it's the same exact thing about the methodology, but you add a K at the end, meaning you tell them what you learned or what you put in place to ensure that thing doesn't happen again. So I see a question inside of the chat, right? What if they ask about a failure you experienced or a weakness, right? When we talk about a failure we experience, then you want to use the START methodology. Always end on a positive note. You never want to end an interview example painting yourself in a negative light. So even if you're talking about a failure, now you wrap up the answer with here's what I learned from it, and here's what I made sure I put in place to never experience that again, or ensure that doesn't happen again, or reduce the chances of that thing happening again. That way, they know you are somebody who reviews and sort of learns from their mistakes or their issues or their failures, right? So we want to throw a K at the end of that. I hope that makes sense to everybody. If anybody has any question on it, then please feel free to put that inside of the chat. Now, before I get to the interview tools, there are a couple of things that I want to address. So I want to address the about me question. Tell me about yourself, right? That's a dreaded question for a lot of people. Let's first start with something you shouldn't do. We shouldn't go down any personal pathways, right? Meaning we should not tell them about, how many siblings you have or how many children you have or that you're married or any of that type of stuff. We're not looking for personal information here, right? We're looking for professional information, which means in this answer, we should only be referencing things that are related to our work experience, to our school experiences, or relevant volunteer experiences or organizational experiences, right? Meaning if you had an organizational leadership role. Those are the main experiences that we utilize here. What I find, and what I find it to be one of the easiest methodologies for people to remember in this about me question is what I call the past, present, future formula, right? So you give them one or two pieces of your past that are relevant to what you're trying to do, meaning you talk about the one or two jobs or whatever jobs, and you give them skills that are relevant or results that are relevant from those. So you're not rambling on, you only give one or two examples. Then you give them an example from your present, right? Your current job or your current company and what you've done there that's relevant. And then you tie it all together with how that would help you in the future at their company or organization. Right. So to give you an example, you guys know I do career work. Let's just say I was applying to be a director of the Career Center. Well, I would say something like, well, my name's Tristan Layfield. I'm the owner and head career coach at Career Clarity Solutions. Shortly after graduating, I went to do research for the university, but after my funds ran out, I actually went into executive management and retail. And that is where I had the opportunity to learn a little bit about career work. I was managing a team of 8. I hired for my team. I got to do interviews. And this is really where I noticed that people had an issue conveying the value they bring. From there, I actually moved to a biotech company because I wanted to marry my science background with the business acumen that I had gained. And I was managing a team of 24 across 4 different states where I had the opportunity to hire. I also helped my director and VP hire for their teams. And this solidified that idea that people really had an issue conveying their value. And that's what prompted me to start my business in 2017. Since then, I've worked with over 1,500 clients, and we have an 83% placement rate within 4 months of working with us. And now I want to utilize all of that experience to help you all build a pipeline program that helps your undergraduates secure positions in the programs they've been studying, right? A few things from the past, a few things from the present, and how that will help the company or organization in the future. Brooklyn put a very, very good model inside there, which is the FIT model, favorite, insight, transition. I love that model as well. That works very, very well for this type of question. Now, the other thing, and then I'm going to just quickly run through some tools. The other thing I want to address is the question that a lot of people struggle with, which is what is your biggest weakness? All right. I tell people to always read through interview questions and try to figure out what are they actually asking you, right? Do they want to know a weakness just because they want to know a weakness? No, right? Think of it this way. I worked for Thermo Fisher Scientific, which has 80,000 employees worldwide. I worked for IBM, which has 400,000 employees worldwide. Organizations like that do not have the opportunity to help every single one of their employees, number one, recognize they have weaknesses, and number two, work on getting better at those. So, what they want to know is are you someone who recognizes your weaknesses and actively works on those, right? So, what I tell my clients is when you hear that question, don't hear what is your biggest weakness, hear what was your biggest weakness, meaning choose something that you were weak at and tell them how you work to get better at that thing. Now, you don't have to be a whiz, right? But you want to show them that you recognize you do have weaknesses and that you actively work on those weaknesses. That's how we answer that question without painting ourselves in a negative light. Okay? Now, I'm going to get to a couple of the questions you put in the chat as soon as we wrap up with interview tools. These tools are going to be provided to you in a document at the end here. But the first thing is your friends and family. Ask them to ask you a couple of interview questions so you can practice, right? If you can't find somebody in person, that's fine. Get on Zoom with a friend, FaceTime with a friend. I don't care how you do it, right? If you don't have friends and family that are willing to help you, set your phone up and record yourself answering the questions and watch it back. Give yourself some feedback, right? Would you hire this person? Is your body language showing up correctly, right? Make sure you look at those things. Next, oh, I said record yourself and analyze. So clearly I'm getting ahead of myself. But yes, analyze that and give yourself some feedback. Third, Google has a tool called Interview Warmup. It's actually an AI-based tool where you can provide it access to your microphone. It'll ask you an interview question. You actually verbally give it your answer. It transcribes it on the screen, and then it gives you actual feedback on your answer once you have completed it. It'll do 5 questions, and then at the end of that, it'll ask you, do you want to repeat these questions, or would you like a new set of questions, right? Now, this I will say this tool is more tech-based, but they do have a general interview option. So just choose that if you're not in the tech space, and it'll give you some general interview questions to practice. Next, LinkedIn has an actual interview prep site that has actual interview questions broken out by different types of roles. And then people who hold those roles, or people like myself, career coaches, go in and provide example answers to those questions. So you can see how others have answered those or would recommend you answer them. And so in the document that you're going to get, it's actually a LinkedIn interview prep site that will give you a lot of examples of those answers. Now, do not go on there and take those examples verbatim, okay? Do not do that, but use them as a way to figure out how to structure your answers or to really get you thinking about what type of examples you should be using, right? And then lastly, AI systems. Now, I know this is a controversial one. A lot of people, may not necessarily like the utilization of AI and impacts and things of that sort, and that's completely fine. If you do not, then feel free to just avoid this. But those of us who are of the mindset that AI is here, it's not necessarily going anywhere. You can utilize it for your interview prep. Now, I put some of the interview tools down here. There's also an AI interview tool called Big Interview. And through, I don't know if it's the Career Center or the Alumni Association, but either one of them, through them, you are able to access Big Interview for free. And in the resource sheet that you're going to get at the end, it tells you how to, what organization or what information to use to set that up. But in that information resource sheet that you're going to get are also AI prompts that will help you prepare for your interview. Okay. Now, these are just some of the AI prompts that you'll see. These are actually going to be inside of the document you get. So I'm not going to actually run through these at this very moment because I want to get to your questions. And as I said, these will be in the reference sheet at the end here. Okay. So now it is time to get to the Q&A. I saw a couple of people and here. I'm just going to get to a couple that are already
Yeah,
in the
thank
chat
you.
real quick. Yeah, perfect. How would you handle an employer asking about a gap in your resume when the reason for the gap is very personal? That's a very great question. If you are willing to share a little bit of detail, I would say try to be as upfront and honest about that as you possibly can, right? I've worked with people who've had to take a year or two off because they had to help take care of a terminally ill family member, right? If we are as honest as possible throughout answering that, and just let them know, hey, I have a gap here simply because I took some time off to take care for a terminally ill family member. You don't have to go into the details, providing anything further than that, but it allows people to understand that and not start to make up stories for themselves about what you were doing during that break. Because that's what tends to happen when employers see gaps on resumes, they start to assume we were just out here playing video games and eating Cheetos all day, right? When in reality, we could have been doing something incredibly important and incredibly personal, or dealing with something very personal. And so you take it to a high level of what you provide, but being as honest as we possibly can in that. Now, I do see, is that free? Yes, Google Warmup is free. The LinkedIn interview prep tool, all those are free. Thank you, Brooklyn, for providing the insight. Is the weakness framework in the resource guide? It is not, but Tamara, it's very easy. It's literally instead of what is your biggest weakness, it's what was your biggest weakness. So just remember that. Choose something you were weak at and got better at. Okay, we're good. We're okay. They're just running on the questions today. Okay.
And we have
Do you,
quite a few in the Q&A as well.
so let's get to
Um,
some of the questions that you have or questions in the Q&A, and I'll reach out to some of these other folks.
Perfect. Thank you. All
Mhm.
right. So one question that was in the chat is how can you put getting fired from one of your previous jobs into a better light and not have a negative impact on your interview?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Now, here's the deal. Oftentimes, one of the biggest things that I tend to recommend people do is to not immediately go to, hey, I was fired from that job, right? Um, you know, it's not going to help you in any way. And in most instances, employers aren't necessarily going to find out exactly how you left that job most of the time. Many of them are using, if they're looking to verify your employment, they're usually using what's called the work number that they can call to get information on your background. Anything you've had W-2 or 1099 employment from is documented there. The government started this a while ago. It's currently run by Equifax, the credit monitoring company, but they can call there and get that information. So they're not necessarily going to know immediately that you were fired. Oftentimes, what I recommend is saying, letting them know that, like, unfortunately, that role just simply wasn't a great fit, but here's what I've learned from that opportunity, or here's the skills that I've gained from that opportunity, right? That's typically what I recommend people do versus outright saying, I was fired from that last role. And this is coming from somebody who was literally fired from their first job out of college. There's an article that I was interviewed for on the Muse. You can literally Google Tristan Layfield fired. You will find the article. So mine is out there for the world. I'm still here. I'm still thriving. So I'll tell you, it's not the end of the world. Okay.
Thank you, Tristan. And we do have a couple of questions about gaps in employment, and we have a resource that we can share to touch on that. All
Mhm.
right, so what are some questions you should avoid asking the interviewers because they seem a bit too generic or a little too cheesy? So, in addition to anything that you can find on the website, any other suggestions for questions that people should avoid?
Yeah. So obviously, we should avoid asking any personal questions about the interviewer. That is something that we shouldn't necessarily jump into. As I said earlier, I'm not the biggest advocate for asking about money initially, just because it is off-putting to a lot of employers that would be at the end of a second round, if at all. The other things are just anything like that makes you seem like you are not in it to do the job. So, oh well, when does my PTO kick in? Or things like that that just make them seem that makes it seem like you're there for another reason other than coming and helping with the issue that they're hiring for, right? Those are the things that we want to tend to avoid. I also avoid very generic questions like, well, can you tell me about a day in the life of this role, right? I just think it's too generic of a question. And oftentimes it's also asked to people who may not know the day in the life of the role, like the HR person, right? There's things that I would ask, like, can you tell me a little bit about some of the challenges you all are facing right now, right? Rather than saying, tell me a little bit about the role, because that tells me a little bit more about what I'm getting myself into than, just asking them about something generic like that.
Perfect. Thank you. All right,
Mhm.
we'll ask a couple of more questions before we wrap up. How differently should you prepare for group interviews compared to one-on-one interviews? And this person has an upcoming interview with 22 people in the group. So any suggestions for group versus one-on-one?
Okay, so a person with 22 interviewers in one room, that is honestly to me a little crazy to have that many people inside of an interview. So I'd make note of that. But what I would say is I don't believe the preparation is that different, right? I think it's all generally the same preparation. Now it just becomes a bit more intense because instead of having to figure out questions for just one person, you have to figure out questions for at least half of those people that you're going to be interviewing with. The other thing is, now you don't just have one person to look at, you have multiple people to provide that eye contact to. So it's not that it's the exact same thing. It's not that it's not the exact same thing. It's just that it essentially becomes 22 times the work at that point in time. But the preparation itself would be almost exactly the same. And I saw that Nathaniel said it has him very, very nervous. I get it. My anxiety rose when she said 22. So I get it, Nathaniel. But if you want to talk a little further, you're going to get a link to book a consultation with me. Let's do that, and we can talk a little bit about your group preparation. But it's going to be virtually the same.
Perfect. Okay, last question we'll answer live, and then we'll give you more information about how to connect with Tristan to talk through more of these individual questions. What are your thoughts about employers who want to record the interview if the interview is virtual? Any suggestions there or thoughts?
So personally, I wouldn't have any issues with an employer recording the interview. My assumption would be that the employer is trying to limit the amount of your time that they have to take up, and potentially providing that interview for other people to also give their analysis on what you said there, right? And so I do believe that it might be a little bit more of an efficiency tactic than anything. Now, the thing that would concern me is if your interview is very case-based, right? If they're asking you to work on a specific case and they want to record that, there's a very good likelihood that you are actually solving a problem for that company for free at this very moment. And they are trying to record this so that way they can utilize your answer down the line. That would be a very concerning thing. So if that is the case, I would ask a couple of questions like, how is this recording going to be used? Right? How long will it be retained? Will I have access to this? All these different questions that will sort of let them know that there's some red flags going off for you with this recording of the interview. But if it's a standard interview with behavioral based interview questions that tell me about yourself, the weakness thing, typically I would not be very concerned about those type of interviews being recorded. It'd be the things where they actually had you do some work for that
Mhm.
interview, like full work.
Perfect. Thank you,
Mhm.
Tristan. All right. So, everyone, please join me in thanking Tristan. You can do that in the chat. You can use the reactions, whatever we need to do. Let's give Tristan some you of them love. Tristan, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise, and of course, giving back to the U of M community. So you're welcome to connect with Tristan over LinkedIn. And we've shared the link in the chat, but when we follow up via email tomorrow, we'll also share there the link that you can use to schedule a free 30-minute consultation with Tristan so that you can get to more of your individual questions. That email will also include the recording of today's webinar. We saw a couple questions about that, and then a ton of resources from Tristan, but then also some additional resources we have from the Alumni Association. So when you get the link asking you, it's in the chat right now, but when you get the link asking you to complete a survey to give us feedback, please go ahead and do that so that we can use your feedback to make some adjustments to what we're offering you. We are here to serve you. And in order to do that, we need to know what you want from us. So again, thank you everyone for being here with us today. Thank you for everywhere you're coming from. We did see a few people calling in from LA. We certainly have you all in our thoughts. And please let us know if there's any way that we can serve you. All right, everyone have an awesome day. Go Blue.
Go Blue. Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan.